Okay, it seems like we've resolved our technical issue, so we're ready to get started here. I want to thank everybody for coming out to this event. It's made possible with the generous support of the Institute for Faith Working in Economics. And our guest today is Dr. Ann Bradley, and she's going to be talking to you, as advertised, on capitalism, Christianity, and inequality, which if you've read the newspaper or listened to the nightly news recently, you probably are aware that inequality is an important political issue these days. And Dr. Bradley's done a lot of research on kind of the intersection between our economic system of capitalism and the biblical approach to thinking about capitalism. So she's going to share that with you tonight. Dr. Bradley is the Vice President for Economic Initiatives at the Institute for Faith Working in Economics. She has a PhD in economics from George Mason University, and she's written on a wide variety of topics, including, obviously, inequality and capitalism, and it's our pleasure to have her here. A few housekeeping notes. If you didn't hear them earlier, there are 2 sign-in sheets over on the snack table. The first one is if you're here for extra credit for my class or Dr. Cook's class and or Professor Russell's class, please sign in to that sheet. It should be clear to you which one that is. And then there's a second sheet there that is a sign-in for our sponsors, the Institute for Faith Working in Economics. And if you sign in and give them your email address, they will put you on their mailing list. So, but there is a potential upside to doing that because we will be giving away some books, selecting randomly some of you who have listed your name there. So please sign in, and without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Bradley.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Economists always talk about how incentives matter, and I see that Dr. Bennett has perfected that by giving you caffeine and cupcakes so that you could, and extra credit, so that you could come hear about income inequality at 6 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday night. So I appreciate you being here. I am really excited to talk to you about this idea. It's something that, as Dr. Bennett mentioned, I've been thinking about and writing about for about 4 years now. I think it's a really important issue as we go into a presidential election, which is what we're doing. And this is not inside the Beltway, but it's close enough that that's what Washingtonians love to talk about, even if it's not a presidential election year. So I think as Christians, when we kind of think about what we're called to do, both in our personal lives, both in our work, and then how we take these ideas into the voting booth, we need real clarity on this issue. And we have to know that there's going to be a lot of people that are fighting to provide that clarity. And we have to judge whether it's really clear and what the truth is. So kind of what Dr. Bennett and I talked about when I was preparing this talk was this idea of how to think about our Christian ethos, our values, what Christ has called us to do in the world, how that manifests in our personal lives and then bubbles up into this kind of bigger political and economic system. And then how we can use that to think about these bigger issues of capitalism and income inequality. So that's a huge topic, and we could be here for a whole semester. We're not going to do that. I'm going to try to keep myself to 45 minutes or so we can have questions. But I'm going to give you a high-level analysis from my perspective here. So I'm going to put up a quote that you see here. I'll read it to you for those in the back. In case you can't see it clearly. You don't necessarily need a choice of 23 underarm spray deodorants or of 18 different pairs of sneakers when children are hungry in this country. Who said that? Any ideas? Shout it out. Yep, this guy said it. What does Bernie Sanders want to do right now? Theoretically, he wants to be the president. But he's vying for your attention, and he wants to provide what he sees as clarity over an issue like how many spray deodorants are the right number to have. And his comment here is we can presume, this is out of context, of course, but his comment here is that that's too much. That 23 deodorants when you go into Harris Teeter is wasteful. And that 18 different types of sneakers, whether those are choices in DSW or whether those 18 pairs of sneakers are actually in your own closet, that's wasteful and potentially even exploits people. Just the fact that we have those choices could potentially be exploitative. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Here's another one. Inequality is the root of social evil. Who said that? Anybody remember? This is over the last year. It's one of the, I think, most famous tweets ever. I don't tweet a lot, but I heard about this one. And this is Pope Francis, who was just here. So this is another person who is coming from the space of the gospel and is vying for our attention, and is trying to participate in the conversation that would help us understand truth as Christians. And I think that's the first thing we have to be after, is truth. Nothing else is acceptable. I think the unfortunate thing is that we know that the Bible is not an economics textbook. You're not going to find demand curves sloping downward. You're not going to see that graph. And that's hard for us. And so then enter in lots of noise. So there's a lot of noise around these issues. As Christians, I think what we have to do, what's incumbent upon us, is to first say, the Scripture is absolutely our guide for faith and practice. It tells us everything we need to know and applies to every aspect of our life, including how we should feel about income inequality. It may not be written down very clearly. There may not be a verse that talks about what the right level of income inequality is, but the principles that are woven into the very fabric of creation are quite informative. So it's incumbent upon us to know those so that we can think critically about these types of issues that, again, a lot of people are fighting to provide the truth. And we have to kind of go to the Scripture first if we really want the truth. Okay, so let's go to the Scripture, shall we? This is a lot of text, and I know it's not very readable, maybe from far away. Sorry about that. But what I want to think about, and I want to get us to think about, is what are God's purposes in his creation? Because that's where it all starts. And this is just Genesis 1, 25 through 28. And it's talking about God's acts in creation. What is he doing? He's creating the earth. And he's telling us what we're supposed to do as part of that creation. And I think 26, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and the wild animals, and on it goes. And verse 28 is particularly important. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth and subdue it. I highlight the word earth there because he didn't say fill the garden and subdue it. He said fill the earth and subdue it, which means that it was always our job to at some point leave the garden. We were banished from the garden because of our sin. So we make this, our sin makes this process of fulfilling what God has asked us to do hard. It's broken because we're broken. And our sin interferes with our preferences, our choices, all the things we do. So sin makes our job harder. But what I want to get across is that our job never changed. We sinned. Our job didn't change. So the job that's laid out for us in creation, which is to fill the earth and subdue it, never changes. We've changed because we've succumbed to sin. So we've made our job more difficult, but it remains. That's really important. So I think Genesis is the first place we have to go to say, okay, who am I and what am I supposed to do? What is this whole world, what is this life about? So God's purposes in his creation, first and foremost, we should never forget, are his own glory. He made the earth to reflect his glory. He's the master artist, the master physicist, the master chemist, the master creator. And so all of us are his unique creations. And we are supposed to work, and in our work, we can glorify him. So remember, Working the garden and taking care of it is part of our original job description. Our original job description doesn't change. Our sin makes our living out of that job description, our execution, difficult and filled with tribulation and trial. But again, the job description doesn't change. So we work, and that's where I think we have to start talking about economics, right in Genesis. And so I want to talk a little bit about how our job description to work is manifested in creation. And there's a couple of economic realities and principles that we're going to talk about that are going to help us through that. But we were made to be in community. Again, look at the story of creation. Adam wasn't alone for very long. And the intention was for us to multiply, always. We need each other. We were made to be relational. God is a relational being. We see that in the Trinity. We are relational people. We are not silos, independent. We can't do everything on our own. And economics actually helps us understand that if we understand economics. We are creative. There's no person on the planet that has ever walked the planet that is exactly like you. There never will be. You are unique and special, and because you're an image bearer, you have massive dignity and worth in the eyes of your Creator. That is profound. And it means that as you guys at this stage in your life, you're thinking about what I want to be when I grow up, right? And let me tell you, that's not always an easy question to answer. It takes a little time, so be patient with yourself and give yourself some grace. But that's what you're trying to figure out. What do I want to be when I grow up? Well, the answer to that question isn't anything you want to be. Your job is actually to figure out who God created you to be and to live into that. And so in doing that, we have to defy the culture. Because the culture says be the best in the world and be whatever you want to be. And that's just not true. You can only be the best that you can be. So I think that's an old army slogan. Be all that you can be, that's good. Be anything you want to be ever, not possible. We are limited. We were created uniquely to do something. And how does that manifest itself? Through our work. And there's this momentum. There's something about how God created us that we always want to improve. So we were put into the garden when we were asked to work it and take care of it. Those are two distinct pieces of that verse in Genesis. To take care of something means don't ruin it, right? So if you go and you're hired to be a house sitter, what do you do when you're house sitting? You just kind of make sure stuff doesn't get broken. Nobody breaks in, you feed the dogs and the cats and all that kind of stuff. But you're not going to put an addition onto the house while you're there, right? That's not your job. You're supposed to preserve it. But that's only part of our job description. So we're not to destroy the creation, but we are to cultivate the creation by unleashing our unique talents onto it. So that's the economics right there. We are made with momentum to improve. And I think there's something really special about that because God doesn't need us. He's perfect. He didn't need us to improve his creation. But he created us to do it because he wants to be in relationship with us. And when we unleash our creativity on the creation productively, then things work the way they were supposed to before the fall. And we glorify him. There's something very profound and I think liberating in that and exciting. So it's up to you to figure out what that is. What has God called you to do? And I know that's the hard part. It takes a lot of prayer. So there's some economic realities that we have to understand about ourselves, about our anthropology, about the world we live in. We live in a world of scarce resources, and those resources have multiple and competing ends. Scarcity is really the backbone of economic thinking. If we had no scarcity, then we really wouldn't have trade-offs. There wouldn't be costs associated with our choices. But because we live in a world of scarcity, we have to make choices, and those choices, by definition, impose some cost on us. You sitting here tonight means you're not doing something else. Perhaps something you'd prefer to do, but I'm going to work on amping up the energy level here. Right? So there's always a trade-off. And so we have to be wise stewards of our time, of our talents, of our treasure. We think of stewardship as Christians and we think, how much am I tithing, or am I tithing, or how do I get to tithing? Or am I going to volunteer with the youth group, or am I going to go on a missions trip? And those are part of stewardship, but it's a narrow view. A bigger picture is all of your energy, all of your decisions. Where do I go to college? What's my major? Should I take this class? How much should I study for a test? And we don't want to be wasteful in any of those decisions. Does anybody here want to spend 10 hours writing a paper when you could spend 8 and get the same grade? No, because we view that as not using our scarce resource of time as productively as we possibly can. So our decisions bring costs. That's our nature. So stewardship is right up there in the creation. We have to be good stewards of what God has given us. We also have to know that we can't create something out of nothing. Only God can do that. He can create something out of nothingness, but we are asked to create something out of something. So the creation is here for us, and we are asked to move it forward, to cultivate it with our talents. So for some of you, that's going to mean being an accountant. For some of you, that's going to mean being a software engineer. You may not think intuitively that those are ways that you can fulfill the creation mandate. But if that's what God has called you to do, then you should do it with excellence and with integrity and being the best steward that you can. And this also helps us understand, because the thing is, I'm talking to a room full of believers. So we come to this from a different perspective than the culture. Right? So how do we live amongst Christians and non-Christians and get this to work? How is it that we can have a society where people trust each other and people rely on anonymous strangers to get things done? And so we're going to talk about the fact that all of these things that are laid out for us, I believe, in creation, need an infrastructure around them to work properly. And so people respond to incentives. This is another kind of economic reality. The only reason I bring these things up is because if we ignore these economic realities, we do so at our peril. They are the same type of realities as the realities of physics are to us. If I go to the top of this building, I have no idea how tall it is, but if I go to the top and I get on the roof and I walk off the side, what's going to happen? Bad things are going to happen to me. I'm going to fall because gravity is my reality. I can't change it, but the good thing is I don't have to have a PhD in physics to know not to do that, because I respect these rules that guide the universe. These are the same, and they deserve our attention and respect in the same way. And so this gives us, again, the clarity when the world is vying for our attention and telling us how to think about things like income inequality. We have to come at it with these principles and understand that what we want is not always what we can get. Why? Because we live in a world of scarcity. So we need to understand that from the get-go. I think the last thing to sum up this idea of the economic realities is that when we use our gifts, we are better able to serve other people. And we are freed from having to do everything ourselves. And that's incredibly profound. When we have to do everything ourselves, life is really hard. Okay, so let's talk about how kind of thinking about the morality of all this works together. So if you just buy what I've said so far, you might not. But these ideas that there's some realities, they are principles that are laid out in the creation of who we are as humans. The way that I like to talk about this is that this is our anthropology. This is who we are. We are not silos. We are not islands. We need each other. We're relational. We live in a world of scarcity, and we respond to incentives, to name just a few. That's a recap. So how does it work when we have to live amongst each other, amongst strangers, really? If we think of trade, market trade, voluntary market trade, as a place where I can come to the table and offer up my gifts, and someone pays me in return, and that frees them from having to do what I do, and then I'm freed from having to do other things. So let's use this beautiful coffee shop as an example. I love to talk about coffee. So when I go to Pete's, I'm freed up from having to do a lot of things that I get to take for granted. That's really important. I get to take for granted. I don't know how to make a latte. I have no idea how to raise coffee beans. I don't know how to raise a cow to get milk from it. I have no idea how to make those sophisticated machines that whistle and have steam and all the fancy things. I just hand over $4 and I get a latte, and life feels pretty good. I am oversimplifying it, but that's kind of the point. If I had to do all that stuff by myself, guess what? I wouldn't have any caffeine. I'd be sad. Because it would be hard to do it all by myself. So the thing is, when we trade our gifts, we not only serve other people, but we liberate both them and ourselves. Because I don't have to figure out all that stuff. I just get to walk into Pete's and they help me with it. And I don't have to know them. They don't have to know me. So it brings together anonymous strangers to serve one another. And remember, I talked about incentives. The incentive is to serve when this works well. That's powerful. And it's the opposite, if I can take on Mr. Sanders for a minute, of his claim. What's embedded in his claim is that having 23 brands of deodorant is somehow wasteful. If we think of trade as a pie, I picked this nice, beautiful looking cherry pie. And if I set a pie in the middle of that ottoman right there and I said, go for it, guys. Caleb is going to do well. He picked a good seat because he's right there by the ottoman. And if it's just about first come, first served, then if he's feeling really hungry, hasn't had a lot of dinner, he might take a really big piece. And if he takes a really big piece, there's less available for the rest of us. There's less available for the rest of us. And so then we have to think about, how do we divide up this pie? What if the pie gets stolen? What if it goes moldy? Then we have no pie. Oh my goodness, then what do we do? So this brings very scary questions to the forefront. But my argument here is that when we trade with each other based on our skills, not only do we serve and become, get served, but we create an ever bigger pie. So I think Mr. Sanders, while he has really good intentions about caring for the poor and wanting a society that's just and not exploitative, in this way, he and I very much agree. I think where we disagree is the means to accomplish that. What does a just society look like? It doesn't look like people stealing from a very limited resource. In fact, what we know is that when people are given property rights and ownership over the things that they've earned, then they create more and more and more and more. So what's interesting, and I should have checked my numbers on this before I came in, but there was an article or blog or something a couple weeks ago, and somebody has done some research to figure out how many trees are currently on the planet. Does anybody see this? Did you see this? So there's like 3 trillion trees or something, crazy. I don't know if that's the number, I'm making it up. But there's a lot of trees. And somebody has done some geointelligence to kind of figure this out. People didn't walk around and count the trees. So don't worry about that. So there's a lot of trees. There's more trees than there's ever been on the planet, according to the people who did this research. There's also more people than have ever occupied the planet, 7 billion people. So you would think all of us people, we need a lot of tree products. The obvious things, paper, all those tables, chairs, things like that, but there's a lot of products that come from trees that we're not even aware of. Resin products and all these things that we don't think about. So how is it that the population is doubling and tripling and doing all this stuff, and we need all these scarce resources that come from trees, yet there's more trees than there's ever been before? It's because the economy is not a pie. When people have well-defined property rights, actually their incentive is to preserve that scarce, precious resource and actually make sure it doesn't run out. That's what we want. I'm here to say that you can have that and have 23 brands of deodorant. That choice is what people need. That the problem with the world in 2015, the tragedy of 2015, is not that in the United States you can walk down the aisle of Harris Teeter and pick from 30 deodorants. The tragedy is that there's people who live in Rwanda right now who have no deodorant and they don't even care because they have much bigger issues to worry about, which is, how am I going to eat today? How am I going to not be a victim of political oppression today? That's the tragedy of 2015. We understand how to be wealthy. So it's a tragedy to me that there's still a large population on the planet, smaller than it's ever been before, but still a large number of people living on less than $1.25 a day. That's the tragedy. And here's the thing, guys. We should have all the emotion and run into that issue with our hearts first. I agree with that. But we also have to have clear-headed thinking about how to fix the problem. Because if we run into the problem with our hearts and not our brains, then we might actually make situations worse. And we never want to do that. That's not good stewardship. So that brings me to kind of start this conversation of income inequality. I'm trying to make the case to you that income is not a zero-sum game. The 23 deodorants argument is that there's some people that have a lot of choices and they're really rich because they've exploited other people. I don't like the pie analogy because it doesn't leave room for the pie to ever get bigger. And in a society where we have lots of economic freedom, a rule of law, sound money, a legitimate and limited government, low levels of regulation so that people have autonomy over their lives and say, hey, I'm going to wake up in the morning and I'm going to decide I want to be an entrepreneur and do this. And that they have the freedom to try. That's what we need. We need an opportunity society. And it has historically elevated more people out of poverty than anything else. So we have to get this idea that earning income by itself as exploitation is not right. And the evidence doesn't support it. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about how you can engage in exploitive earnings. And so, again, as Christians, our job is to say, if voluntary market trade protected by the rule of law and property rights helps the poor, we understand very, very clearly from Scripture we have to help the poor. I think for Christians, the argument is over how. So if voluntary private trade has helped people out of poverty, we need to support it. We need to look at the instances where people are using trade exploitatively and stop it and fight against it. So that's where I'm going to kind of get into this income inequality debate, because I think that's going to help us understand what good income inequality might look like and what bad income inequality might look like. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about. So you may not be able to, again, from the back, I'm sorry, clearly see this image, but I found this online. And it's a woman who's holding a handwritten sign, and it says, "One day the poor will have nothing left to eat but the rich." I suspect there's some tongue-in-cheek in there. But if Bill Gates can only be as rich as Bill Gates is because he is stealing and he is pillaging and he is exploiting and he's taking away opportunities, then it's our job to stop him. Agreed? That's not a tough one to answer. The question is he? Is he exploiting? Are people who are super wealthy only rich because they've stolen and lied and cheated and plundered? We know there are parts of the world where that's absolutely true. Pakistan today is one of the most destitute places on the planet. The people who thrive there, the Taliban for one, thrive because they have their boots on the back of the rest of the population. They are plunderers and thugs. But I submit to you this, they are not as rich as they could be and as prosperous and have the longevity that they could have if they would give up the thuggery and think about serving people. So the process of market trade induces people to serve each other. It doesn't ever get away, doesn't ever get greed fully out of the picture. And that's the thing I think we have to keep in mind too. We are sinners. Anytime humans are in the picture, there's a propensity for sin, because that's what we do. So we have to work to always, daily, hourly, by the minute to overcome our sin. And so there's no perfect. Markets aren't perfect. Governments aren't perfect. None of this is perfect. So perfect is not the right question. The right question is, in a fallen world where we're sinners and we're also interacting with people who reject Christ, how do we make this work so that we can get as much prosperity as possible? I think that this topic of income inequality really got jump-started again. I mean, it's as old as humans are. The rich and the poor, go read some Shakespeare. You might be doing that now. This is kind of not a new topic. But the Occupy movement certainly brought it to the forefront. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this, I think you're going to hear this rhetoric in the presidential debates, amongst the presidential forerunners. You're going to hear about income inequality. Income inequality sounds like a thing that makes us shudder. It sounds bad. It sounds like something we want to run away from. My question is it? And I'm going to take us through some thinking on it. And my question is, not sure. So, I'm going to talk to you a little bit how economists measure income inequality. This is the most technical we're going to get all night, so nobody panic. What economists do is they use kind of a statistical tool called the Gini index or the Gini score, the Gini coefficient. And it ranges from 0 to 1. A score of 1 is indicative of perfect income inequality. It quite literally means one person has all the income earning potential and everybody else has nothing. I don't know about you, but I would not be super happy to live in that world unless I'm the one that has all the money, maybe. But it's going to be hard to figure out. It's the pie. You know, one person has all the pie and nobody else has any access to anything. That's tough. A Gini score of 0 is indicative of perfect income equality. Quite literally, everybody has the same earnings in terms of their income. That feels better to us, maybe. It feels more just. It feels more fair. It feels like there's more access. Because what we care about is that the poor have greater access to the things they need to relieve the very difficult trade-offs that come with being poor. Right? I think that's what we care about. So part of why people don't like economists is because we talk about things like Gini coefficients and we forget the people. I want us to remember the people. Because what do we care about? We care about the poor and their ability to not be poor. What does that look like? We care about thriving and flourishing. We care about all those things. So based on the 30-second lesson we've just had, you might have had more if you've talked about this in your econ classes. Where would you like to live? Country A over here on the left has a Gini score of 0.278. Remember, 0 is more equality in terms of income. Country B has a score of 0.457, less equal in terms of income. Anybody want to tell us your preference? Where do you want to live? Yeah.
B.
You want to live in B? Okay, why?
Because I want the ability to earn more if I work harder.
Okay. And so does that score tell you that maybe that's possible? Okay. Anybody want to live in A? It's okay if you say yes. Now you guys are really way too smart for this exercise. So these are real Gini scores. Right now, 0.278 is the current Gini score of Afghanistan. And 0.457 is the current score of the United States. So the little exercise, which you got, I'm assuming, before we even did it, is this notion that just looking at the numbers alone, I don't have a lot of clarity on the living conditions, on what it's like to be rich, or what it's like to be poor, or what my mobility of my income is. What can I consume each day? I don't know those things by looking at the numbers. And I don't know anybody who wants to live in Afghanistan because it's a nice place to live. I don't know anybody. In fact, we require people to go over there to fight for freedom. And some don't come back. It's a destitute place. The Gini score alone would not tell us that. In fact, just looking at the numbers, it would say, hey, the people have more income equality. Great. But it doesn't do what we are after, which is help us understand whether people are thriving, whether they have a chance. That's what we care about. So what does the Gini tell us? This is the big question. Dr. Bennett and I were talking about this before the talk, and I'll give you the bottom line up front. I'm not really sure what the Gini tells us. Here's what I care about, though. How are people doing? What are the consumption capabilities of the poor? That sounds like, a huge phrase. But really what I mean is, if you're poor in a country like Afghanistan, how many calories can you consume a day? How many calories do you expend a day just getting by? Do you get to see a doctor? Are you likely to be a slave in some way, shape, or form? And, what does this look like? The Gini doesn't tell us these things. And what does it take to no longer be poor? These are the questions that the Gini can't tell us. What does it look like to start at the bottom and move out of the bottom? We want a really robust, mobile society where people have to start somewhere, but they move out. But even if you start at the bottom, you can have shelter, medical access, food, clean water, these types of things. So what does good look like is what I'm after, and this doesn't help me get there as an economist. And so I worry when we hear people throwing out these debates on income inequality without peeling the onion. Because again, as Christians, what are we after? We know we have a call to care for the poor. We also know we have a call to live out the creation mandate. How do we enable people to do that? That's the question. Okay, so this is US income inequality over time, from about 1913 till just recently. What do you guys think? I mean, just looking at it, again, I said it ranges from 0 to 1. So if you look at our track record as the United States, we're really between 0.4 and 0.5. It's hard to know, again, if 0.5 is really bad. As you can see, if you look at the graph in 1933, what was that? The Great Depression. Times were tough for everybody, and you have a spike. You would perhaps expect some of that. And then it goes down, and then you kind of have this trend line up. And so I think that's what economists are talking about. I don't know if y'all have talked about some of this in your classes, but Thomas Piketty wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century. He's a French economist. He writes a 750-page book, and it sells out on Amazon. This is mind-blowing to me. How many people want to read a 750-page book on income inequality? Not many, but apparently lots of people did. I mean, he's stimulating a debate here. And he has some pretty radical suggestions about how to solve the problem. We're not going to go into all of this. I don't want it to be, me against Piketty. But what he's addressing is this upward trend. And that's what economists care about. We don't care about one data point. We want to know about that data point relative to the past and how it helps us understand what we can expect in the future. So for me, as a professional economist, I'm still kind of clueless. If we were close to 0.9, would I say that's bad? Probably. But is 0.6 bad? I don't know. Because what we really have to, I think this doesn't tell us what we need to measure, which is how are people faring over time? And again, what does life look like if you're at the bottom income quintile? And how do you get out of the bottom? So there's a robustness measure of a movement that's not being captured here. How we calculate the Gini matters too. So if you hear somebody saying, hey, Sweden has a Gini of, 0.27 or something, it's something like that, 0.28. And the United States has a Gini of 0.457, so we need to be more like Sweden. Well, Sweden has a population of about 8 million people, and we have a population of 300 million people. So this is all based on the pool of the people you survey. As you survey more people, you would expect their incomes to be more diverse. So how we measure it and what we count matters. The other thing that matters are taxes and transfers. What we tend to do in a country like the United States is we have progressive taxation, right? Which means that as you earn more and more, you pay a higher percentage in taxes. So we would have to subtract the taxes from their overall income when calculating the Gini. You tracking with me? And then if we take those and give it to people who are in the bottom quintile, that's called a transfer payment. And when we give it to people, we would have to add that to their income. If we're not subtracting the taxes and adding the transfers, we're actually going to exacerbate income inequality. But when you account for the taxes and the transfers, income inequality is much more even or closer to even. And the question is that good or is that bad? That's an entirely different conversation that we have to have on another day. So it is important to help the poor. The question again is how do we best do that? Is it through taxes and transfers? Maybe. There's also a lot of other ways. The church has a really predominant role in doing this. So that's probably another conversation for another day. And then demographic changes. There's a lot of things that have changed, particularly in the last 100 years in the United States, that change income inequality. For the better or for the worse, potentially. So if you have a lot of immigrants coming into your country and they're filling lower skilled, lower educated labor pools, or if they're filling those types of jobs, then you're going to have people coming into the workforce at a lower income. That's going to change the Gini, right? The question is that good for the economy or bad for the economy? There's a potentially big upside to that. So there's a lot of things that we can't just look at in isolation. We have to take the entire picture and how we measure it. And if we don't do that, and I would say some of the academic economists that are out there are not doing justice to all of this stuff. What I'm saying is the genie of Afghanistan and the genie of the United States, the little thought experiment we did, isn't even comparing apples to apples, because we can't assume that each country is calculating it the same way. And so it's not necessarily going to lead us to the right direction of what's the policy solution. What I think we need to be talking about is income mobility and this bigger idea of economic freedom, which I'm going to address in a minute. Income mobility actually is much harder data to get, because what do we have to do? We have to track individuals. So you'd have to take, if you're going to track my income mobility, you're going to have to look at me over about 20 years, 10 years. And you're going to have to say, this is where Ann Bradley entered the workforce. I could tell you, I'm from the area. My first job was at Mount Vernon, George Washington's house. I worked in the gift shop. And I love that experience, but I think about these poor people that hired me and what a risk they were taking. I mean, I had to have a working permit. I had no experience. The only thing I had done was babysitting. And they're putting me on the cash register. That's a risk. But you know what? It was an important opportunity for me. And what did I do? I finished high school, I went to college, I went to get a graduate degree. That's my path. I'm not suggesting that's everybody's path, but those things enabled me to get out of whatever I was making, $3.50 an hour or something. So if you think about income mobility as a ladder, what's really important for the poor is that they have a lot of opportunities to get on the ladder and then climb up through effort, through work, through unleashing their creativity. That's what we're all asked to do. We need to make sure we're not truncating the ladder. If we're going to saw off, the pegs at the bottom, we're making it harder to get on in the first place. We don't want to do that. We know that for sure. So income mobility trends in the United States, there's not a lot of good data on this. But what we know is that it's been fairly stagnant over the past 20 years. And so my question is, why? Why is that happening? We want a lot of income mobility, right? We want to say, okay, you may start with lots, not a lot of skill, maybe not a high school diploma, you don't have a lot of experience, but you can get on that ladder and learn and increase your wage. Why? Economists talk about this all the time. The reason that wages increase is because our productivity increases. The value contributions we make increase. And so that's what we need to think about, is how do we make people more productive? What helps them in that effort? And that's going to foster income mobility, more productivity. And it doesn't look like everybody getting a PhD because of what I said at the beginning. God has not called all of us to get PhDs, right? Hallelujah, amen, right? If you don't want one. So God is going to call us all to do different things based on who He created us to be. We can't forget that. But what we want is, regardless of whether you're a CEO or a janitor, very different places on the income distribution. What does it look for you to thrive? What does it look like? And we need an economy rich with opportunities for all different education and skill levels. That's what we're after. So, excuse me, what I want to talk about is, oops, I got a little excited, sorry, is what does the world look like? I mean, we've kind of talked theoretically for a little bit. We've talked about income inequality, hard to measure. Even when we measure it, it's hard to know what it's telling us. So what are we left with? What can we look at to say, is the world a better place than it used to be in terms of income and consumption, or is it not? And I think that this graphic speaks volumes. This is world GDP from AD 1, which is a long time ago, and we didn't have a Census Bureau, so it's back of the envelope calculations, until now. Economists call this a hockey stick graph, because most of humans in all of human history have lived at subsistence levels. They have had to think about, where's that next meal coming from? Where am I going to sleep tonight? Am I going to be the victim of political oppression? That's what most of human history has looked like. It's only been recently, in the past 200 years, that productivity has exploded, wealth has exploded. With that have come a lot of good things. Longevity, for example. Literacy. Political freedoms. Lots of good things associated with this explosion of wealth that has touched every corner of the planet, not equally. So again, what do we care about? We care about the places in the developing world that are not as, on the upward slope of this as we are. And how, the question I think for us as Christians, what I'm trying to get us to do is say, let's not talk about income inequality. Let's talk about how to foster this. Let's talk about what the poor really need, which is access and alternatives to goods and services that make their lives easier and better and longer. That's what I want to talk about. I don't think the difference in my income, between my income and Bill Gates' income, are telling of that much. Bill Gates is a lot richer than I'm ever going to be. I'm just a little academic working in a think tank. But here's the difference. And when you think about yourself, perhaps, and Bill Gates, you might think, we've got nothing in common. You actually have a lot in common. If Bill Gates wants to go from Seattle to Percival, he has to do the same things you do. He gets to do it a little easier. I mean, I have to kind of go on kayak and find the best flight price, and then I have to roll my suitcase through the airport and, park in long-term parking, which costs $12. I mean, I got to do all that stuff, right? And he just has the jet, and it waits for him, and he doesn't have to go through TSA. He just gets on, and they say, "What would you like to drink today, sir?" And, he's on his computer, and he's doing stuff. But he's still, when we're in the air, we're the same. He has to fly 5.5 hours or 6 hours or whatever that takes, and so do I, and so do you. So prosperity that we see here reduces the consumption differences between the uber rich and the rest of us. Most of you in this room have probably been on a plane. If you haven't, you most likely will be. You get to do that. You don't have to be Bill Gates to get on a plane. That's phenomenal. We should think about, that's the stuff, I mean, I'm a nerdy economist, but that's the stuff that should get you excited. And how did this happen? It's amazing. So, how can we just make this distinction between good income inequality and bad income inequality? I think we have to talk about what I've tried to lay out heretofore, which is this idea that when we come together in a system of economic and political and religious freedom, and we're allowed to use our gifts and we serve other people, again, whether that you're an accountant, an engineer, a historian, whatever it is that you aspire to be, if you're doing what God has called you to do and you're praying about it unceasingly, you can be sure that he wants you to do it until he asks you to do something else, right? So if we're doing that, we are serving others. We are liberating them from having to figure out how to do it themselves. And that's going to make some people really rich. So, I like to use my little smartphone as an example. I remember, by the way, I'm older than you guys. When I was in college, when I started graduate school, it was 2000. Hopefully you were all born then, or I'll feel really old. I'm teasing. You guys got to laugh a little bit more. We need some more cupcakes around here. So when I went to graduate school, I got my first cell phone, and I was so excited. And I just thought, I have made it. I'm Bill Gates. I'm just kidding. But, I was a poor graduate student, but I had a cell phone. And it's something they call the brick. So it's kind of like what they use in hospitals now. It's this thing, and all it does is, you can call. You might have been able to play a game, I'm not sure, and it had a green screen, and, you could run over it with your car and nothing would happen because it was this really hard plastic. I was super excited about that. You could text, but, to get C, you had to press 1 3 times. So to text something took a really long time. I was thrilled to bits and pieces that I had this phone. That phone now, none of you own. And you're poor college students, right? Not one of you own, is my guess. I mean, maybe you do. But most people have this fancy-dancy thing that, I can do my Christmas shopping on, I can look up a recipe for dinner tomorrow, I can do some reading for class while I'm on the bus. It's made your life better, and you have access to it, and you don't think of yourselves as rich. But the people who came up with this have been paid handsomely. Presumably, if they're doing that legitimately, then that kind of income inequality is not bad, it's actually good. So some income inequality, some rich, thriving middle class, is a sign of creativity, entrepreneurship, value creation. But I want to talk about the kind of income inequality that I'm talking, the bad income inequality. What does that look like? And to me, I think we have to talk about cronyism, which economists used to call rent seeking. And this idea, and this particularly is relevant when you have a large company. Doesn't mean that all large companies are bad, by the way. But large companies have a lot of excess capital. And when you have a lot of excess capital, guess what you can do? You have cash reserves to hire an attorney, set up an office on K Street, and lobby. Not all lobbying is bad, so don't hear me saying that either. But what we're seeing on K Street is an increasing trend of corporate interests trying to rig the game so that they benefit. And if they are rigging the game, then they're benefiting at the expense of someone else. And that's exactly what we don't want. Because here's the problem with that kind of activity. The poor don't have access to it. My cousin lives, we're all from Alexandria, but he works in DC right now and he has a food truck. This is a big thing in DC right now. He has a food truck. So he used to be a restaurant manager and he really wanted to open his own restaurant and he couldn't do it because it takes over $1 million to open a brick and mortar restaurant in Washington, DC. He could not afford it. And he had this entrepreneurial idea and so he said, I'm gonna have a food truck. And it didn't require a ton of capital. He still had to buy a truck and come up with recipes and brand it and all this stuff. So now he has this food truck. It's a micro business opportunity. It's a small opportunity for him to be able to unleash his creativity and give people grilled cheese sandwiches, by the way, which is what he makes. So that's important opportunity because Bill Gates, or those guys, they can open the brick and mortar establishments. But the rest of us can't do that. So we want those opportunities to get on the ladder. And if we thwart that, which cronyism often does, because it shuts people out of the competitive game, then we are actually engaging in reverse income inequality, meaning we're benefiting the rich at the expense of the poor. And we would never want to do that because it's unfair, it's unjust. So there's a lot of good reasons to do that. So there's a lot of examples. I don't have time to go through them, but you can just go through example after example. If you see what's going on with Uber, I'm sure you're all familiar with that, where it's basically being, or it has in some cities, still currently is in some cities, being banned. Why would we ban that? Why would we take, well, this is what I call a micro business opportunity. If you have a car and a good driving record and insurance, I got in an Uber the other day, the guy said, I have 4 kids, a full-time job, and I do this 6 hours a week on Saturday to earn extra money for my family. Why would we want to take that away from him? I have no idea. I can't think of a good, ethical, sound, legitimate reason why we would. So then why are we seeing places say no to Uber? Because the existing cab companies would love a world where they have less competition. So that's why I think we need to focus not on income inequality and trying to solve it, because I don't even know how we would do that. I think what we need to focus on is income mobility, which is fostered by economic freedom. And economic freedom is the opposite. I'm going to skip through some of this. It's the opposite of cronyism. It's if you have an idea, you can try. There's no guarantees, but you can try. So this is another sign that I found as it related to the Occupy Wall Street movement. This woman says, I don't mind you being rich, I mind you buying my government. And I think that's the attitude we need to have about what cronyism is. Just because you're rich doesn't mean you should have any more favor with a political representative than the rest of us. There's a justice issue there, and it tends to exploit the poor by blocking them off from opportunities. So what I want us to focus on is economic freedom. Hold on, I'm going to skip this, I'm sorry. Okay. Economic freedom saves lives. Economic freedom is when we have a society with lower levels of regulation so that people are not encumbered. Things like Uber, people can do these kind of micro opportunities, the gig economy as we're calling it. When there's sound rule of law, a legitimate government that protects people's property and their earnings and gives them incentives to serve others. Remember, we talked about voluntary market trade as win-win because we're serving each other. We're not plundering each other, we're serving each other. That's what we want to foster. Economic freedom tends to do that. And I can't underestimate how much that this is literally saving lives. So I'm going to give you 2 examples, and then I'm going to be quiet and we'll take questions. This is the first example. Where is this sweet boy? Who I don't know, by the way. This is from Google. Where is this little kid? Can you see what's in his mouth? Dental tools. He's at the dentist. How many people like going to the dentist? It's a party, it's a good time. Oh, you like going to the dentist. Bless you. I loathe going to the dentist. It freaks me out. I don't like the sound of the drills. I mean, it just gets me all worked up. I don't like it. But do you know that going to the dentist every 6 months saves and extends your life? Because in 1750, if you had an infection in your tooth that went to your brain, you were dead. You were dead. George Washington, by the way, when he was inaugurated president, one real tooth left. They tried to save him all. I mean, this is the president of the United States, and he has one tooth. That would never happen now. Why? Because we have all these ways to protect our teeth, and when they fall out, we just get fake ones. No big deal. That's amazing. Economic freedom is saving our lives. This extends your life from 20 to 50 to 70 to 90. And it allows us to do what God put us here to do, which is only you know that. But that it's your responsibility to do. So we have more time to do that. So economic freedom saves our lives, and we're ignorant about it. I don't go to the dentist and say, you know, you're my hero. You're saving my life. I definitely would go to the cardiologist that way, right? But I wouldn't go to the dentist with that attitude. But he or she is saving your life, and you get to take it for granted. And that's an amazing blessing, an amazing, profound blessing that we want for everyone. So I think that there's these benign ways where economic freedom saves our lives and we're ignorant of it. But then I think that there's going to be times in your life when economic freedom is going to save your life and you are going to be very aware of it. And I'm going to tell you my story. So this is my daughter. Her name is Bailey Grace. She just turned 2 in June. When I was pregnant with her, my water broke at 26 weeks, which is extremely dangerous. And so I had to go immediately into the hospital. I went to Loudoun County, which is where we live in Ashburn. I went to Loudoun County Hospital, and they said, if you have your baby today, we actually aren't even equipped to take what we call a micro-preemie. We can't take babies born under 28 weeks. So you have to get out of here, because we'd rather transport you with your baby in the womb than have you in a crisis situation. So I went to Fairfax Hospital as soon as they could find me a bed. And I stayed in Fairfax Hospital for 5 weeks. 5 weeks. Every 4 hours, specialists came in and they did a couple things. They took my temperature, they listened for the baby, and they were trying to basically see if I had an infection. Because if I had a fever, it was the sign that the baby had an infection. We were going to have to deliver right away. Every day that she wasn't born was a victory for her. It extended the possibility that she would live. And she was born at 31 weeks, which is still really tiny. And then she lived like this for 5 weeks. In fact, the first 2 weeks of her life, I couldn't even hold her because she was so delicate and so susceptible to disease and germs, I couldn't even touch her. So the doctors would reach in through this thing, and you can't see really well, but she has a feeding tube through her nose that's going right to her belly. Preemies can't regulate their temperature, they can't eat, and they can't regulate their heart rate. So when her heart rate started to crash, alarms would go off all over the place and people would come running. It was terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And here's the thing that I want to leave you with. Economic freedom saved her life because I'm not rich. I mean, I'm rich in global terms, but I'm not Bill Gates. We already talked about that, right? But I got to walk into a hospital where people dropped everything and took care of me for 5 weeks. People who are self-interested, I have no idea if they're believers, I have no idea. And all I could think about while I sat in that hospital bed was, what if I was Rwandan? I would be dead, and she would definitely be dead. I would probably be dead. And it wouldn't have been my fault. The conditions are out of my control. I had nothing to do with the fact that I was born in the United States. That's not something I did. Economic freedom has sustained and prolonged our lives, and this is what we need for the rest of the world. Not income equality. We need this. And that's where I'll stop and take questions. Thank you. Oh, yeah, we're going to do the raffle. Sorry.
So I do promise there will be question and answers, but I just want to give you a reminder, if you want to be eligible to receive some books, we're going to do a drawing. So if you haven't signed in yet, please make your way over there quickly, because I'm going to walk over to that table, and by the time I get there and pick up that sheet and bring it back, I'm going to draw some numbers. And those numbers, the people who are signed in with those numbers are going to win some cool prizes. All right? And so now we have a long line, which means I have to tell a story. So Dr. Bradley mentioned her first job. So Dr. Bennett's first job was delivering newspapers. You know how much I got paid? Probably about $10 a week. And that was yeah, back in the old days when we had to deliver shoes in our bare feet in 3 feet of snow. So yeah, I think I've experienced a little bit of income mobility. Not much. They don't pay me much more than that. But I'm happy. So that's another important thing is we have to be satisfied with our lives, to be doing what God is calling us to do. And I love teaching here. I love interacting with the students and you guys. And so that makes me happy. Dr. Bradley also was describing some of the cool things that we carry around in our pocket on our cell phone. And something else cool that it does, which you'll get to see in a little bit, is I was able to pull up a random number generator so that I can pull random numbers and give away prizes to you guys. So something else very cool that we wouldn't have had even 10 years ago. If you think back, everyone's used to having a computer now. I see several look around, most of you have a computer right now. You don't remember when they first invented computers and they were like the size of this room. And the inventor of, or the former head of the company that first came up with this big mainframe computer laughed when someone suggested that people might like to have this piece of equipment in their home. He's like, this is the size of a home. Nobody wants to have this in their home, and now everybody's got this in their pocket, which is something we couldn't have imagined even 20 or 30 years ago. And this is all, result of the technological progress that's been possible under this free economic system that we have. So, you guys about finished signing in over there? Yeah. All right. So I'm gonna walk in. I'm gonna walk over there because I'm out of stories, and I've been talking for 3 hours already today. So I'm tired of that. So I'm gonna walk over there, and Jonathan, you're gonna be the end of the line over there. So or you're one more. Okay. So you bring it up to me, and I think what we can do is go ahead and start question and answer, and then we'll take questions till about 7:30, maybe a few minutes after, and then at the end of that we'll go ahead and do the drawings. Okay. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll bring around the microphone. And please do limit it to questions and not prolonged statements.
Thank you so much for speaking here today. The question that I have is, how would you address just the fear of people that are poor?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I like about it is that it's coming from a place of empathy, I think, which is important. I think it's important to realize that we are not here to save the poor from themselves, but we are called to help them. And I think the other part of your question is to say, I'm not sure. I think, when I talk about this idea of income inequality, sometimes I get a similar question, and the only thing I know for sure is that the model of Jesus won't lead us down the wrong path. And the model of Jesus as he cared for the poor is that he got into relationship with them. And I actually think that we won't know what it feels like, what it looks like, how the poor suffer, what their feelings are, unless we get into a relationship with the people that we claim to want to help. I think, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent maybe, but I think over the last 100 years, poverty alleviation has become very sterile and not very relational. So we talked about this before. We use our taxes as a way to help the poor. I'm not saying that's by definition a wrong thing, but there's something non-relational about it. And my sense about it is this. I mean, if you can imagine people who are poor, living below, whatever the federal poverty limit is, there are probably lots of different people in that category. So let's say that you're poor because you lost your job and you didn't have a lot of savings and you have to live on the street and support your children. That person is a unique individual who has unique gifts that needs unique help. The heroin addict, who also might be homeless because of an addiction, is another unique individual with unique gifts who needs unique help. So I think we have to really think about that and say, we don't know what the poor need, because the poor are just a group of people that are unique individuals created in God's image. And so I think the best way that we can help them is not assume too much and actually get into a relationship with the people who we want to help and love them through it. It's not just, here's the other thing I think that's happened in the kind of poverty alleviation movement over the last 100 years. It's kind of gone somewhat away from the church and more towards the responsibility of the state. And that's why I think part of the problem is that the state can't love people with the love of Christ. I mean, it's just not set up to do that. And so I think we've gone away from the relational part of helping, and we've made it all about material problems. Yes, the poor have material disadvantages and they need help. They need access to medical care and shelter and all these types of things, but that's not all they need. If you have somebody who's a heroin addict, they don't just need money. They don't just need a place to live. They need you to love them out of that addiction. And the gospel is it for that. So, sorry, that might be long-winded, but that's my sense. We can keep talking about that.
I guess you've convinced everybody, so no further questions.
Yeah, or we need more cupcakes.
There
Or
are
maybe
some-
there's been too many cupcakes in there. Sugar coma has set in.
Yeah.
Teasing.
Questions? Chad?
Something we've been talking about in our various economics classes is trying to figure out how we can deliver this sort of message to people effectively. Like you brought up the quotes earlier from Bernie Sanders and Pope Francis, and the things they're saying feel right, and
Yes.
the things that we say and that you say, we know they're right, but they can often come off as heartless. So how do we deliver the message effectively?
I also love this question because, yeah, we're doing it wrong. That's for sure. We meaning economists, we meaning, I don't know. There's a lot of people we can lump into there. I think we don't lead with our hearts, especially as economists, which is why I made that comment about I don't ever want to talk about big numbers without tying them back to the people. So if you take an economics class with me, one of the first things I say on the first day of class is that I don't know anybody, not even Dr. Bennett, okay, that goes to bed at night and lays their head on their pillow and says, oh my gosh, GDP last quarter was not where I wanted it to be, and I'm really freaking out, and I'm stressed about it, and I don't know what to do, and I'm tossing and turning. I don't know what to do. Nobody thinks that way. Why? Because GDP is kind of up here, and it's not related to people's lives. It's not intimate. It's not personal. It doesn't help me understand my felt needs. That's what we have to do. But people do worry about these things. Am I going to get a job? Can I pay my rent? If my kid gets sick, do I get to take them to the doctor? These are the real needs of people. And so I think we have to speak into that and never, ever, ever lose the human element. So I did say a lot of things tonight that were kind of economist-y because that's who I am. But it is about, there's truth in all of that, right? It's about making people more productive. How do we do that? How do we unleash opportunities in entrepreneurship? Those things are all important. But if we don't contextualize that with a heart for people, we're never going to win the fight. I just don't think we're ever going to win the fight. I think if we run out there with GDP and blah, 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 no one cares. So I think we have to be really winsome, and I think we have to lead with our love for people. I try my best every single day to kind of defeat the stereotypes of an economist. I get up here, I'm all I talk about the people that I claim to care about. I think we just got to stop talking about numbers so much. That's my sense, but I don't, that's hard. It's hard.
I guess I'll stop in the radius. We just had a Faith and Reason lecture where one of our professors, Dr. Les Sillers of journalism, gave this very nice lecture about telling stories. And I think as economists, we do a very poor job of telling stories. Part of that being because much of what we do is very empirically, quantitatively driven. So some of the examples you give about, your own daughter, like how she was able to survive and you were able to survive is a story that needs to be told and reproduced along with the empirical observations.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the U.S. government has stepped in an area that traditionally has been held by the church and family. However, do you think that the U.S. government came in and wrested control of this, or they stepped into a vacuum that the church and family had already vacated and they were responding to a felt need?
I think that there's a lot of dynamics going on there, and actually, I brought a couple copies of our book, and there's a couple chapters that try to address this. But really, prior to federal income taxes, all poverty support, charitable support, was done privately, or at least locally. And so, and yet at the time, we were still on that upswing of, that hockey stick graph. So I don't think it's empirically valid to say that the state is, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but I don't think some people do. They'll claim the state is the only way we can provide charity. I don't think that's true. I do think there's something also, another aspect at play that economists talk about, and they call it the crowding out effect, which is, remember, so the thing that we have to remember about, and this is where if I could have a chit chat with Bernie Sanders, this is where I would love to chat with him. The thing about the government, with all the wonderful things that we want it to do, the government can only acquire revenue by taking it from somewhere else. So it can tax, it can borrow, and it can inflate. The government is not Bill Gates, okay? They don't sell toothbrushes by day and take the profits of the toothbrushes and engage in charity. Bill Gates actually does that, right? He makes computers and software, and then he has this huge charitable endeavor that he does on his own time. He's free to do that. That's great. But he had to create wealth first and then be charitable. He had to have actually excess capital. The government doesn't operate like that because it's not motivated by profit and loss. So the thing is, that's where the crowding out effect comes. Every dollar that we tax is a dollar not able to be used in the private sector. So I'm not saying we would never tax. I'm just saying every time we tax, there's an opportunity cost. And there's an opportunity lost in the private sector to do that very same thing. So I think the evidence suggests that we can go a long time without this massive federal support programs and actually help people be mobile in their income. So the problem is that the state has resources that your little church doesn't. The federal government has at its disposal lots of money. And it's very hard for local organizations to compete with that. And so that's kind of where the crowding out comes in. So I don't necessarily think that it was a takeover. I think it was more gradual than that. But I do think it's hard for smaller churches to compete because they don't have the purse that the federal government has at its disposal. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. In response to that, then, you mentioned it's hard for the local church to compete, just power of the purse, it's so small. Do you think contributing, specifically in the United States, to this issue is the fact that the U.S. is so broad, varied, and just massive in comparison to like European countries? In addition, the United States has never had a more centralized church. We've been fragmented, whereas in the U.S. you either had U.S. Catholic, the Roman Catholic Church, or other things that was able to be kind of a bastion for this. So do you think we were kind of already prone towards U.S. government jumping in because we're so fragmented? It's hard to actually unite resources and do this.
I don't actually, I'm not sure I think so. My sense is that it's not just about having a lot of money. I mean, we've thrown a lot of money, for example, at different, Lyndon Johnson declared the war on poverty, 51 years ago, I think? 51 years ago, and I believe that numbers are something like $13 trillion or something. It's a huge sum of money that we can't even conceptualize, and we haven't really made a dent in the percentage of the population that's living at or below the poverty. So it's not about money. It's really not about money, and that goes back to this gentleman's question that he asked before, which is, what is it like to be poor? I don't know. I've never lived on the street. So I think that it's not just about money, it's about the transformative power of the gospel. See, the thing is, money doesn't give people dignity. Our creation in Christ is what gives us dignity, and so our job as Christians is to help people live into their dignity. How do we do that? Well, we take them back to the creation mandate, and then we help them with whatever help they need. So I actually think what's lacking is time. I think if we were really going to help that heroin addict, we would say you probably need 5 years. I mean, I'm just making up numbers, I don't know. Are any of us willing to get into a relationship where we meet with people and we counsel them and we help them with vocational training for 5 years? That's harder than writing a check and walking away. I'm not saying we shouldn't write checks, but I don't think we should ever write a check and walk away. And so the model of the federal government is write a check and other people will handle it, and nobody ever talks about the relationship. And that's why I think we haven't made a dent, because we're just throwing money at a problem that's just not monetary, it's spiritual.
So you mentioned community, and I've noticed that a lot of Americans start moving around. Like recently, and I don't know what the data on it is, but people don't live in one place all their lives. So how do we have community if people aren't in the same community, if there isn't a long-standing community?
I still think you can have community through your churches. So for example, if you live in some place for 5 years and you become attached to a church and then you go to another church, I mean, I think you're right that communities get more uprooted than they did before. For example, my grandparents lived in a small town outside of Boston their whole lives, and their extended family is still there, and they didn't move. So it is probably, there's some ability to know what the community needs, to know new people, to know how, but I don't think that just because we're more transient, we can't have community. And my point is also that I didn't probably make as well, is that market trade actually brings us into community with strangers, which is actually kind of a counterintuitive thing. It's the Pete's example. It's, I don't have to know everybody and all the things that go into making a latte to benefit from it. And there's a community in that, but it's a community of strangers. So I think there's two different types of community we have to address. That the market brings strangers together and incentivizes them to serve one another. That's one piece. But then there's this other piece when we're talking about charity. How do we bring local communities of transient people together? I think that's a different question, but I absolutely don't think it's impossible. And one last thing, maybe social media and the transparency of the digital age maybe makes that a little bit easier, because you know the needs more than you might 100 years ago.
For coming to speak with us. Thank you. So I think in a system of democracy, we have a problem where the government has a strong incentive to give people exactly what they want, which is also not the best thing for them. And so government can only be expected to operate on their incentives. How practically and less theoretically do we, in a democracy, employ legislation or measures that would reverse this trend towards giving people what they want in exchange for votes?
Yeah, wow, that's kind of the $64 million question. I don't know is the answer to it. I think, so for me, when I think about cronyism, I think that's kind of in your question, which is this, or at least I'm thinking about it as you're asking that, this idea that, yeah, people vote for things that they claim that they want, but they might not even be good for them. And politicians have incentives to respond to what majorities want and what special interest groups want and things like this. And so we get into this mess where we have all this stuff, it's maybe not good for us. How do we reverse that? To me, I think we have to arm people with the knowledge of basic economic way of thinking and the corruption points. Where can democracies become corrupt? Where is this, what is the trend for cronyism and big corporate interest? People have to know about that, because otherwise I don't think that they're going to necessarily storm DC and do anything about it. So at some point I think we have to say, look at the way that evangelicals over the past 40 years have fought for the lives of unborn children. They've taken that issue extremely seriously. They've made their concerns very vocal. They've gone to politicians and said, you have to be on board with this. And politicians have responded. That's a good way. I think we need to take the issues of economic freedom as seriously because lives hang in the balance. We don't think they do. We don't say, oh, cash for clunkers. Who cares? Oh, cash for clunkers was about cronyism. It was about making people like Honda, who were already rich, richer. By kind of forcing me out of my car that I was happy with and into some other car in the name of environmental stewardship, so it all sounds good, but it's kind of lining the pockets of people who are already wealthy. But I don't think most people are ready to storm Washington over that because it seems like, who cares? I think we have to care. I think these things are stewardship issues, and we have to take them seriously. I'm not saying cash for clunkers is more important than the pro-life movement, so don't hear that. But I am saying that when we have less economic freedom, people lose their lives. I mean, look at what's going on in Venezuela right now. Look at the former Soviet Union. People died under totalitarian dictatorship because there was no economic freedom. So we have to be very passionate about that. So I think, for me, I view my role as educating and talking about these ideas and getting people fired up about them, because I think, as you say, if we take this passion to the voting booth in large droves, somebody's going to respond because politicians want to get elected. But I think we have to first raise awareness that there are even issues. That's hard, though, and unsatisfying because it takes a long time.
So we maybe have time for one more short question if there's one. Otherwise, we can move on to the raffle.